The only man-made object on Earth the astronauts could see from outer space was the Great Wall of China. Although it is one of the most astounding accomplishments of man, it failed to keep out wave after wave of barbarian invaders. Startling new archaeological discoveries in China may shed light on why it was built and on the character of the emperor who completed it.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
The Great Wall of China. This huge stone serpent winds across nearly 2,000 miles of rugged mountains in the People's Republic of China. It is the longest structure in the world. The vast land of China has always held mystery for us. Her customs, her language, and her way of life have differed vastly from the rest of the world. Her very remoteness has lent an air of mystery. We have admired her ancient culture and her appreciation of beauty. In Search Of is the first major film unit allowed into the People's Republic of China, seeking answers to some of her secrets. An ancient ruler who could be the key to some of the puzzles is Emperor Shi Chuandi. He became China's emperor in 221 BC. In Chinese, last names come first. The word China comes from the family name Shi, so the land of Shi became China. Even before Shi, however, China had rulers who lived behind this land of walls. Each one built sections of the Great Wall in hope it would keep out the barbarians. The great Tartar leader, Genghis Khan, a brilliant military strategist, had little trouble crossing the Great Wall. Nomad scouts from the Khan's Gobi Desert hordes reported that the Chinese government was weak. There were traitors to open the gates, and the Mongol hordes swept through to conquer China. The irony was that after 2 generations, the new conquerors were totally absorbed by the Chinese. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis and the most familiar name to us through the tales of Marco Polo, lived in the height of luxury and ruled over the most splendidly opulent court in Chinese history. A later emperor, Yung Lo, ordered the city of Peking built with high walls and made it his capital because of its proximity to the Great Wall. The ancient Chinese believed that they were the only civilized people in the universe. All others were barbarians. In early times, many local rulers had built sections of walls for the protection of their area. But in 207 BC, one man came to power who was to be one of the most dominant figures in early Chinese history. He not only filled in the gaps and completed the Great Wall of China, but he conquered all of the local rulers and consolidated China for the first time. His name is Shi Chuandi. He was China's first emperor. His accomplishments were many. A skilled general, he put down all opposition by defeating all local monarchs. He built roads connecting his capital with the far corners of his empire. He standardized writing, coinage, weights and measures throughout the land. At the University of California at San Diego, we spoke with Professor of History, Dr. Pikowitz.
Virtually everything that he did tended to bring China closer together as one unit. It put an end to feudalism. And that's the reason why China today, although it's the size of Europe, is one country. We sometimes don't think why Europe, for example, is so many different countries and China is only one country. It's because of what this man did in 221 BC that China is one nation. To call him a Chinese Caesar perhaps is underestimating it.
The Great Wall of China defined the emperor's territorial limits. The 2,000 miles of wall was purposely built along the most difficult mountain ridges of northern China. This huge stone casing, filled with tamped earth and rock, is larger in bulk than the combined pyramids of Egypt and Mexico. It rises to precipitous heights and plunges into deep gorges. It is one of the wonders of the ancient world. Some parts of it are so remote they are seldom seen by man. Old sections of wall were linked together from the Pacific Ocean to the vast westward stretches of the Gobi Desert. It meets the eastern terminus for camel caravans on the fabled Silk Route from the Middle East, the path followed by Marco Polo in his famous travels. Chinese travelers of the period were terrified that they would die beyond the Great Wall. They were afraid their spirits would be unable to pass through the wall to find rest in their homeland. The emperor's most astounding accomplishment was the completion of the Great Wall. It was, however, constructed at enormous human cost. Many peasants who built it froze to death in the severe northern winters of the land. Hundreds of thousands of conscripted workers died from extremely harsh treatment at the hands of the emperor's guards. Beneath the massive stones lie the remains of those laborers who perished, earning it the name of the longest graveyard in the world. The emperor's harsh measures were not only felt by the laborers, but also by scholars and intellectuals. Their thinking had been formed by the great teacher Confucius. They were pledged to respect tradition. Shi Chuangdi wanted just the opposite. He was determined to break with the past completely.
He was known to have carried out a cultural revolution. Although it wasn't called a cultural revolution at the time, it was in fact a movement to erase the history of China in the period preceding his rise to power. He burned books. He buried scholars alive, quite literally. One of the methods used to kill scholars, and I think there were some 460 scholars killed in a 4 or 5 year period. One of the methods of killing scholars was to bury them up to their neck and then to take an axe and lop their heads off. One of his concerns is that he still had rivals in these former kingdoms, these feudal kingdoms, who could threaten his rule. And so he decided, for the first time in Chinese history, to simply collect all of his enemies. 120,000 families were assembled in his capital. He built palaces for them. He built homes for them. But he could keep an eye on them this way. And this is the kind of grand scale on which he always did things.
As time passed, he became fearful of reprisals. He would travel incognito across the empire with a small group of trusted followers. Unannounced, he would inspect progress on the Great Wall, arriving and disappearing quietly. The Great Wall became an obsession. It was more to him than a structure of defense. It was a statement that defined the line between his China and the outside world. Standing on these ancient stones, hearing the eerie sound of the winds blowing along the wall, it is easy to imagine the scene of 2,000 years ago. Stone fortresses were built at intervals as living quarters for guards who were on constant duty. They watched for barbarians threatening from the north. The fear of death haunted the emperor's dreams. He built many palaces for himself across his empire. At his treasured hot springs, the long, cool vistas of crepe myrtle and willow, designed to soothe and calm the mind, brought little solace now. He scurried from palace to palace, sleeping under a different roof nightly. Drawn sword by his side, he was haunted by his enemies, living and dead. Even the roof demons confirmed the fear in his heart that assassins were everywhere. There were many attempts made on his life, as reenacted in the Summer Palace by members of the Peking Theater.
He was a very mysterious figure in some ways, and this is what has interested Chinese historians in him for centuries. He was in search of immortality. He didn't want to die. He had heard a story that in the eastern coastal area of China, there were some islands where sages and immortals lived, and he wanted to find these areas. He became increasingly preoccupied with this in his later years.
One day, as his search for immortality continued, a magician asked for an audience with the emperor. The magician spun tales of a wondrous place to the east, where sages knew of a liquid potion which granted immortality. The emperor insisted on all the details of the miracle potion. The magician complied, and even provided directions to the mysterious land. Shortly thereafter, the emperor embarked on his journey.
It is ironic that during his travels, while trying to find eternal life, he died at the age of 49. During his lifetime, he exerted tremendous effort seeking immortality because of an inordinate fear of death. Even at the early age of 13, Shi Chuangdi began construction of his own tomb so that he would be ensured protection in the afterlife.
Using 700,000 laborers, the emperor spent 37 years building a lavish subterranean palace to protect him after his death. His grand design was an enormous map of China. Each city was represented in miniature, complete with rivers of mercury. The emperor himself was to be laid in a coffin on a huge dragon boat. Statues of members of his personal army were placed to guard the emperor in death. Legend has it that over 24,000 clay soldiers were buried with him. The legendary location of this tomb was said to be under a huge artificial mound called Mount Li in the province of Shenxi. Stories had been passed down that an army of clay soldiers had been buried near the tomb, but none had ever been found. Then, in 1974, in this quiet rural setting, a great discovery was made. Some workers digging a well near Mount Li were amazed when they unearthed strange clay figures. Could these be part of the fabled buried army of the Emperor Shi Chuangdi? In a peaceful rural area of Shenxi province, 500 miles west of Peking, these farmers planted and harvested grain. When the clay soldiers and horses were discovered in 1974, scientists realized this might be part of the legendary buried army of the Emperor Shi Chuangdi. If so, it would be one of the greatest archaeological finds of all time. Some clay miniatures had been found in royal tombs before. They represented guards, wives, and servants placed there to care for the monarch after death. The figures found near the emperor's tomb, however, were life-size, and there appeared to be an entire army of them. When the enormity of this discovery was realized, a huge structure was built over the site of the buried clay army. After further investigation, archaeologists found the army was larger than at first imagined. The emperor's subterranean legions occupied an area of over 3 acres. More than 600 life-size figures have so far been uncovered, and test digs indicate there will be at least 5,000 more. Over a period of 6 years, hundreds of skilled men and women have continued the painstaking work of restoration. One of the original archaeologists at the site discusses the significance of this extraordinary find. It was on this very spot that the well diggers discovered the first clay figures beneath the earth. As archaeologists continued to dig, they were profoundly moved by what they saw. An entire army, battle lines formed, ready for attack. Rank upon rank they stood, silently waiting. They had stared into the darkened silence as 22 centuries slowly ticked away. The only sound, the snap and sag of a pottery neck as it slumped against the ground in some earth tremor. Each face is unique. Perhaps each one is the portrait of a long-forgotten warrior. The logistics of creating this vast assemblage were staggering. An artist imagines the scene as it was over 22 centuries ago. Thousands of skilled craftsmen spent their entire lives on the project. Each figure was carefully modeled in clay, oven-fired, and then placed in formation. It was often the practice to bury live members of a monarch's personal guard with him at his death. If these are indeed the likenesses of Xi's guards, their loyalty to the emperor may have rested in the knowledge that they would not be required to die with him. A museum has been built adjacent to the site where these remarkable examples of ancient Chinese art can be seen and admired. Details such as the bronze bridles found on some of the horses can be studied. A high degree of artistry, even on such a massive scale, was far above that believed possible for this early period. The armor worn by the men and the different dress and hairstyle denoting rank or occupation were carefully reproduced by the artisans. Much can be learned here of the Xi dynasty and of its emperor who built the wall. Perhaps his vast clay army was yet another kind of wall.
The controversy over the Emperor Xi Huangdi continued for centuries. The positive view stresses his unification of China. The negative view of the emperor points out the tremendous cost in human lives of his vast projects and his repression of scholastic learning. There can be no doubt, however, that shortly after his death, China was in turmoil.
A commoner named Shen stepped from the ranks of the soldiers and inspired a revolt against the weak son of late Emperor Xi Huangdi. This soldier became the first emperor of the Han dynasty. The Xi dynasty fell, but the Great Wall of China has remained for 2,000 years. Often neglected, in some places it is little more than a pile of rubble, repaired many times to a semblance of its former condition. Today, the many walls in China are merely decoration, attracting visitors from around the world. The greatest of these walled palaces is the Forbidden City of Peking. It is the most perfect example of the individual isolation of early Chinese rulers. Only the emperor or empress, their close relatives, servants, and high officials were ever allowed through these gates. The Great Wall today represents a eulogy to Emperor Xi for the many positive accomplishments of his rule. It is also a huge stone epitaph upon which is written the horrors that he perpetrated. Perhaps it is a timeless comment on the futility of isolation. Late in the evening, when the last visitor is gone and the wind blows again from the north, the sounds of the dead seem to cry out to us in the whining and sighing of the winds along the parapets. One might ask the question, did the Great Wall keep the world out, or did it imprison the Chinese within? As with many other great works of man, was it worth the thousands upon thousands of lives it cost to build?